She didn't ask permission to come in out of the rain. She just stood on his porch with water running off her chin, looked Thaddeus Calhoun dead in the eye, and said the only words that mattered. "I'm not leaving until you hire me." He had turned away 9 women that spring alone, and not one of them had lasted past the front step. Nora Pell had ridden 11 miles in a storm that came up so fast the sky had been blue an hour before, and now it was the color of a bruise. Her mare had thrown a shoe 2 miles back, and she'd walked the rest, leading the animal by the bridle through mud that sucked at her boots like it wanted to keep her. By the time the Calhoun ranch house came into view, lamplight glowing yellow in 2 of its windows, she was past caring how she looked. She only cared that she'd made it before full dark. She tied the mare to the porch rail with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, climbed the 3 steps, and knocked. The door opened on a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the same hard country he ranched. Thaddeus Calhoun was tall, in the way that made a doorway feel small, with a beard he didn't bother to keep neat, and eyes the gray of a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it would storm. He looked at her with no particular welcome, the way a man looks at weather he didn't ask for. "We don't take in strangers," he said. "I'm not a stranger. I'm the new housekeeper. I sent a letter 3 weeks ago. I didn't answer it. I know. I came anyway." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. He studied her. The soaked wool coat, the mud to her knees, the chin lifted just slightly higher than the situation called for. And for a long moment she thought he'd shut the door in her face, the way the stories said he did to everyone. Instead he stepped back, just enough to let her pass. "Kitchen's through there. There's a fire. Don't talk to me about the weather, and don't ask me questions I haven't given you leave to ask." It was, by the standards of Calhoun Ridge, practically an invitation. That night, after she'd hung her coat by the stove and wrung the water from her hair, Nora sat alone at the long kitchen table and listened to the house settle around her. The particular silence of a place that had forgotten what conversation sounded like. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. No supper was offered. No further word was spoken to her at all. She wasn't surprised. She'd heard the stories same as everyone else in the territory, passed hand to hand in dry goods stores and church socials like a coin too worn to read clearly anymore. Thaddeus Calhoun, the rancher who'd buried something so deep in himself that no woman could dig it back out. The man who'd built 40,000 acres out of nothing and couldn't keep a housekeeper past a fortnight. The man whose wife, and here the stories always dropped their voices, had died in a way nobody said plainly, 3 winters back, and who hadn't let himself be touched by gentleness since. Nora hadn't come for gentleness. She'd come because the wages were good, and because she had a sister in Cheyenne with a baby and a husband who'd gone west looking for work and not come back, and because she had exactly $4 left to her name and nowhere else in this territory that was hiring. She told herself that on the ride out, and she told herself that again now, sitting in a cold kitchen in a house that didn't want her, and she believed it the way a person believes a thing they need to be true. She was up before dawn. She'd learned long ago that the surest way to keep a position was to make herself useful before anyone had cause to ask whether she would be. By the time Thaddeus came down, there was coffee on the stove, the fire built up proper, and breakfast laid that wasn't fancy but wasn't burnt either. Eggs, bacon, biscuits she'd made from memory because she hadn't yet learned where anything was kept and had simply searched until she found flour. He stood in the doorway a moment, taking in the sight of his kitchen functioning the way a kitchen was meant to. He didn't say it was good. He didn't say anything at all. He sat, ate in silence, and left for the barn before the sun had fully cleared the ridge that gave the ranch its name. It went on like that for the better part of 2 weeks. Nora cooked, cleaned, mended, kept the house running the way a house should run, and Thaddeus moved through it like a man crossing a room he didn't quite believe was real. He spoke to her only when necessary, instructions, mostly, delivered in a flat, unhurried that never rose and never warmed. He didn't ask about her family. He didn't ask why a woman would ride 11 miles through a coming storm for a position that had already turned away 9 others. He simply existed alongside her, the way 2 people might share a stagecoach without ever once looking at each other. The hired hands talked, of course. They always did. Otis, the foreman, a wiry man with a face like a dried apple and 20-some years on the Calhoun payroll, took to watching her with a kind of cautious curiosity, the way a man watches a creature he isn't sure is tame. "You'll not last," he told her one morning, not unkindly, as she hung wash on the line behind the house. None of 'em do. He don't mean nothing by it. He just— Otis stopped, searched for the word, didn't find one he liked. He's not been right since Miss Lavinia. Who was Lavinia? Otis's face did something complicated. His wife. You'll not hear it from him, and I'd not be the one telling tales, but you ought to know there's a reason this house has gone 11 rooms and 9 of 'em shut up tight. Best you don't go opening doors that ain't been opened to you. Nora said nothing, only nodded, and filed the warning away with the particular care of a woman who had learned that some doors were closed, for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with grief that hadn't finished its work. She found the room 3 days later, not by searching, but by accident, carrying linens down a hallway she hadn't yet learned. When a door stood ajar in a way that suggested wind rather than invitation, she caught only a glimpse before she pulled it shut again. A nursery. Small and untouched, a cradle still made up with a quilt gone soft with dust, a rocking chair angled toward a window that looked out over the ridge. She closed the door as gently as she would have closed the door on someone sleeping, and she did not mention what she'd seen to anyone, not even herself, not really, though it sat in her chest for the rest of that day like a stone she'd swallowed. That evening at supper, the one meal he took at the table, rather than standing at the stove, Thaddeus looked up from his plate and seemed, for the first time, to actually see her. "You've been here 2 weeks," he said. "Most don't make it past 4 days. I'm not most." "No," he said, and something in his voice was almost curious. "You're not." It wasn't warmth. It wasn't even close to warmth, but it was the first full sentence he'd offered her that wasn't an instruction, and Nora found herself turning it over that night the way a person turns over a coin found in the street, wondering at its worth. The weeks that followed brought autumn down hard over the ridge, and with it came the rhythm of the ranch in its fullness. Branding the late calves, mending fence before the ground froze too hard to set posts, the long days that left every man on the place dropping into bed before full dark. Nora found her own rhythm inside it, and somewhere in the doing of small, unremarkable things. Coffee left warm on the stove for whoever came in late, a torn coat mended without being asked, a lamp left burning so the house wouldn't be dark when he came back from the far pastures. Something in the house began, very slowly, to change. Thaddeus didn't soften, not in any way a person could point to and name. But he began, without seeming to notice he was doing it, to linger a moment longer at the table after supper. He began to answer her questions instead of simply tolerating them. One evening he even told her, unprompted, that the biscuits she made reminded him of his grandmother's, and then looked so startled at himself for having said it that he left the table entirely and didn't come back in till the lamps were lit. Nora caught Otis watching this unfold from the barn doorway one afternoon, and the old foreman gave her a look she couldn't quite read, part warning, part something gentler. "Careful, Miss Pell," he said. "Man's like a horse that's been spooked bad. You don't pull him to you. You just stand still long enough he decides to come." She didn't ask what he meant by it, because she already understood. She'd known horses like that her whole life. Animals so wounded by some past cruelty that the kindest thing a person could do was simply exist nearby, asking nothing, until the animal decided on its own that closeness wasn't a trap. She didn't know, not yet, that she'd already started doing exactly that. She didn't know it, because she hadn't let herself examine too closely why she found herself listening for his boots on the porch each evening, or why his rare half-smile, the kind that came and went so fast a person could doubt they'd seen it, had begun to sit with her long after he'd gone back out to the barn. It was October, with the first hard frost silvering the grass each morning, when the storm came that changed everything. It started the way storms start in that country, a wrongness in the light, a stillness that the cattle felt before the people did. By the time Thaddeus and his men got the herd moving toward the lower pasture, the sky had the color of an old bruise and the wind had teeth in it. Nora watched from the kitchen window as the riders became smaller and smaller against the darkening land, and she felt a fear she hadn't expected and didn't examine, not at first. It was full dark and the wind was screaming around the eaves when Otis came pounding up to the house, half frozen, with the news that Thaddeus's horse had gone down crossing the creek bed, and that Thaddeus himself was a mile out, on foot, in a storm that was getting worse by the minute, with a leg that wasn't holding his weight right. There was no question in Nora's mind, none at all. She had her coat on, and a lantern lit before Otis had finished explaining, And when he told her she ought to stay at the house, that it wasn't a woman's place to go out into weather like that, she looked at him with an expression that ended the argument before it began. "He'd do it for any one of you," she said. "I'm going." They found him a half-hour later, soaked through and shaking with cold, dragging himself along the creek bank with a leg he couldn't put weight on, too stubborn and too proud to have stopped moving, even when every instinct should have told him to. When the lantern light found him, he looked up with an expression Nora had never seen on his face before. Not the careful blankness he wore like armor, but something raw and unguarded, something that looked, for just a moment, like relief so complete it bordered on grief. "You shouldn't have come," he said, through teeth that wouldn't stop chattering. "I know," she said, and got her shoulder under his arm, and started walking. It took the better part of an hour to get him back to the house, the wind screaming the whole way, snow turning to sleet, turning to a hard driving rain that found every gap in their coats. By the time they reached the porch, Thaddeus could barely stand, and Nora half carried, half dragged him through the door and got him into the chair nearest the fire. Her hands working fast and sure to get the wet coat off him, the boots, working a blanket around his shoulders, while Otis went for the doctor in town. It was hours before the fever broke its worst grip, hours Nora spent at his bedside in the lamplight, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, listening to him mutter things in the half-world between sleeping and waking that she understood weren't meant for her ears, a name, said over and over, soft and broken. Lavinia, and once, clearer than the rest, words that finally explained the locked nursery, the 9 shut rooms, the 3 years of a man building walls around himself brick by silent brick. "I couldn't save either of you." Nora didn't ask him about it the next morning. When the fever had broken and he woke to find her still there, asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still resting near his on the quilt. She didn't ask, because some things weren't hers to ask for. They were his to give, in his own time, if he ever decided to give them at all. But something had shifted in the night, in the long hours of fever and cold, and the particular intimacy of one person caring for another with no expectation of thanks. When Thaddeus opened his eyes and found her there, he didn't pull his hand away. He simply looked at her, for a long moment with an expression that had finally stopped being careful. "You stayed," he said. "I told you I would. Most people say a great many things." "I'm not most people," Nora said again in words from weeks before, and this time he almost smiled. It was another month before he told her about Lavinia, and he told her plainly, without dressing it up or asking for pity. His wife had died in childbirth 3 winters back, along with the daughter they'd been waiting for, and Thaddeus had spent every day since building a fortress out of work and silence, because grief, left alone too long in a man's chest, had a way of calcifying into something that looked like coldness, but was really just a wound that had never been allowed to close. "I shut every door in this house," he told her, sitting across from her at the kitchen table on a night when the fire had burned low, and neither of them had moved to build it back up. Every one of them but the kitchen door, because a man's got to eat. I told myself I was protecting what was left of me. Truth is, I think I was just punishing myself for being the one who got to keep living." "You didn't do anything wrong," Nora said. "You don't have to keep paying for it." "I know that," he said. Knowing it and believing it haven't ever been the same thing. He looked at her then, really looked, the gray of his eyes gone soft in the lamplight. "Until you came up that porch in the rain and told me you weren't leaving. I think some part of me believed it that night. I just wasn't ready to say so." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm up to meet hers, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, because there wasn't anything that needed saying that their hands weren't already saying better. Spring came to Calhoun Ridge the way it always did, slow. Then all at once, the snow pulling back off the high pastures, the creek running loud and full, the calves dropping in the lower fields under a sky that had finally, after 3 long years, stopped looking like something to brace against. Nora had stopped thinking of herself as the housekeeper sometime around midwinter, though neither of them had said the word that would make it official. And Thaddeus had stopped eating his suppers in silence, had started, in fact, talking more in a single evening than he'd talked in the whole of that first month, as though some lock inside him had finally given way, and there was 3 years of conversation backed up behind it. It was Otis, in the end, who pushed the matter, cornering Thaddeus in the barn on a clear morning in April, and telling him plainly that a man didn't get a second chance like this twice in one life, and that he'd best stop being a fool about it before some smarter man came along and noticed what was standing right there in his own kitchen. Thaddeus didn't need much pushing, in truth. He'd known for months. He asked her that same evening, not with any grand speech, because that had never been his way, but standing in the doorway of the kitchen with his hat in his hands, like a boy half his age, telling her plainly that he didn't have the words other men might have, only the truth, which was that the house had been a tomb before she walked into it, and it was a home now, and he didn't know how to be the second thing without her in it. Nora said yes before he'd finished asking. They were married in May, on the porch, where she'd first stood dripping and stubborn and unwilling to leave, with Otis standing up as witness and half the territory turning out because, as it happened, everyone for 50 miles had been waiting 3 years to see Thaddeus Calhoun's house come back to life. Nora wore her sister's old dress, taken in at the waist, and when Thaddeus said his vows, his voice didn't break the way some men's did, but his hand holding hers shook just slightly, and she understood it for what it was. Not fear, but a man finally fully, letting himself believe in something good again. That autumn, the nursery door was opened for the first time in 3 years. Nora didn't ask him to do it. She simply found him there one evening, standing in the doorway with the last light coming through the window, the dust cleared away, the cradle set right. He didn't say much, he didn't need to. He just took her hand, the way he'd learned to do without thinking now, and they stood there together a long while, looking at a room that had finally stopped being a wound and started, very quietly, becoming a hope again.